I'm John Buchanan. In another video, we have looked at the new studio piano instrument, and what we're going to do in this video is to turn our attentions to Logic 11's studio bass instrument. If you're watching this 15 years in the future, studio bass was introduced with Logic 11, little history lesson. But right now it's a new instrument, and it's capable of some really interesting things, and really the focus of this video is going to be around the fact that each bass has been presented with multiple articulations, and very soon we'll get into exactly what that means. What I'm going to do is to add the studio bass instrument via the software instrument drop down. Here it is, sitting amongst all of the other studio instruments. Studio bass is here, and when we open it, it looks like this. So effectively what we've got is a range of different bass instruments, all of which can be selected from this little drop-down menu here. We've got a classic bass, a 60s bass, a rock bass, a session bass, a modern bass, and an American upright bass too. And all of them sound pretty good. A bit like the studio piano, I'm just going to go out there and say without any question, this is the best bass or collection of bass instruments that Logic has ever had. And while some of them are better than others, they are all better than what was there within the sampler before. Again, a really useful refresh for an amazingly common instrument used in nearly all music. So obviously we're not really going anywhere with synth bass here. This is all about playable basses, if you like. Now, what I really want to focus on is the fact that for each of these instruments, there is an incredibly large collection of articulations available. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the American upright bass, which is the bass that I want to focus on within this episode particularly. And what I'm going to draw your attention to is the fact that we've got this enormous list of articulations which come packaged with this instrument. So the first question is, what are articulations? Well, before I answer that question, what I'm actually going to do is just to play you some of this bass. And in particular, I'm going to draw your attention to this little area here, because every time I play a note, we're going to see that this little display is going to update, and it's going to show me the articulation that was most recently used every time I play a note. I know you're already bored of me talking, and so you should be. Let's play some music. Okay, so what we've got is this really interesting sounding bass. And as you can see, this display is constantly updating. What are those? We'll come to those in just a moment. For all of the bass instruments, what I've also got is a collection of controls relevant to the type of bass that I'm working on. So obviously for my upright bass, I can control the amount of growl. Think of these as being microphone channels that have been captured in order to capture the essence of everything an upright bass can be. If we put a microphone right next to the strings, we're going to get this kind of growly quality, and I get to decide how much of that I want to hear. If I want something pure in sound, I can dial it back. I can also hear whether or not the attack of that growl, so in other words, whether or not it's a kind of transient, immediate sort of spiky, slappy, fingery noise, or whether or not we're going to let the note happen before that growl kind of creeps in to become part of the sound later. And overall noises, the kind of surrounding sounds of the body of the instrument, all those kinds of things, they get their own channel too. And again, I can decide how clean I want the sound to be or how noisy I want it to be. And for the other instruments, we've got a similar collection of controls which vary in sort of depth and intensity and complexity, if you like. So for example, with the classic bass, I've got an opportunity to introduce a percentage of kind of muting if I want to. I've got overall tone controls and volume and definition. So in other words, how kind of precise the sound is as we play it through. And what we've also got for the 60s model is whether or not we want to sort of focus on whether or not this bass is playing solo parts or whether or not it's kind of like more part of the rhythm section. And again, there are sort of tonal changes for that too. But back to the main point of this video, if we come back to the American upright, is that we've got this articulation set. So articulations literally mean playing styles, and we tend to associate those most with kind of orchestral sample libraries. If we think about the violin, for instance, we can bow long notes, we can pluck those notes, pizzicato, we can play really short notes and really, really, really short notes, and lots of other articulations as well. But of course, that's true for almost any instrument that we could actually pick up and play, including basses. And again, to show you the list, we've got this incredible collection of articulations, which we can then sort of post-produce into the bass parts that we actually want to write and make part of our project. So before I go any further, and before we actually look at how I can access these and how we can make them our performances a bit more real and a bit more interesting, we need a bass line. Shall we record one? Feels like we should. Also feels like this track should be labelled. And now it is. Bit of jazz. Okay, so what we're going to do, in fact, there's one note I really didn't like there, which was the F sharp. I quite like that being, where are you, little F sharp? Oh, maybe I didn't play one. Oh, I see. Nope, my mistake. It's that note I don't want. Okay, what I'm also going to do is just to quantize this a little bit with a little bit of swing. Because if it ain't got that swing, yeah, enough. Interesting. Maybe those are supposed to be 16s. Nice. Okay, now then, let's just focus on this part for a second. Now, whenever we want to add articulations to an individual track within Logic, what we need to do is to go and find its articulation set. And if you're working with third-party orchestral samples, for instance, you need to build those yourself. I know, if only we had a video on that. But with Logic's studio instruments, they have been made for us. So if I click here on the articulation set, I'm going to discover that I have got a collection of articulations for the studio basses, and the studio bass upright, which is the instrument that I'm using right now, has its own sub-articulation sets. In other words, the ones specific to this individual part. So if I select that, straight away, all of the articulations that we saw within the list of the interface are now available to me. How do I apply them? Well, all I have to do is to click on a note and then choose the articulation that I want from the drop down. So by default, what I can do if I want to, although I'm not going to do this, is to select all of the notes and assign them to just one articulation. So if I wanted every single note to be the standard playback sort of technique, well, I can do that. I can apply an articulation to every single note within my project. But that's a bit boring, and it sounds a lot like any old sample bass, where every single note, yes, it's been multi-sampled, and yes, velocity is playing a role in it sounding musical, but more or less we kind of know what the bass is going to do because there aren't any real surprises. So what do I mean by surprises? Well, let's suppose, for example, what I wanted to do was to have this note, the upper octave of this first pattern, rather than just play the pitch, what I wanted it to do was to kind of bend in, either from above this note or from underneath it. Well, one of the articulations that I have available to me, right down at the bottom of this list, is the idea of what we refer to as slide in. And I've got slide ins from semitone offsets, both plus and -1 and 2. Now, I seem to remember that these are kind of weird in that the slide-in minuses come in from above and the slide-in pluses come in from underneath. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right, actually. Sure enough. So the plus value basically means that what we get is this kind of boom, we get this bend on that note. Rather than it just hitting that note, it comes in from underneath. It's quite nice, isn't it? Do you want to hear that again? Now let's also suppose that what I wanted to do was to get rid of this little note here, and instead of having just a played note on this last beat, what I wanted was for my bass player to kind of boom, 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 bend into that note, walk down the scale, but rather than have this sort of note on beat 4, what I wanted the player to do was to say, actually, you know what, I'm going to go for a kind of body slap of the instrument rather than a full note, something that just basically just uses almost the bass as a kind of percussion instrument. Well, we got a couple of those too. So for example, I've got this idea of a left hand pat, which literally means a sort of slap of the instrument with the player's left hand. Or if you want to, we've got this idea of a body tap. Okay, that sounds like this. So we get this nice little kind of stop, and I think that's good. And of course, all of these are velocity sensitive as well. So if I want that to be more articulated, then I can absolutely do that, and we're in good shape. Now then, what if I wanted something that maybe produced a little bit of a slide or something along those lines? Maybe what we'll do is to take this note, for instance, and what I want is a slide that may be just, I don't know, an open slide. Let's see what that sounds like. What I might do is just put a little loop around just this bar so we can just hear that. That's really great. So what we've suddenly got is this, again, just a different sort of flavor on that particular note. Although it would make more sense for that to be more of a kind of standard note, and maybe we lose that note instead, and that one becomes the slide. And the thing that's really nice about beginning to explore some of these articulations, where is it? My open slide is there somewhere. There it is that as you begin to listen back, new things will kind of suggest themselves. You'll suddenly hear a little run of notes and think, oh, it's kind of a bit boring that they're kind of predictable in the way that they are. And again, what we could do here would be to invert this. So let's say we go for a slide -2, which means that what we're going to get is a note that comes in from above. That doesn't work quite so well. So let's again maybe repeat our little trick here of having a slide +2 instead, or maybe a slide +1. We're not hearing the kind of semitone or full tone step there as clearly as we might be, because it's not that sort of instrument. So maybe again a little bit of variation might be quite good. Okay, so let's just actually hear how that sounds against the drums, because it might be quite interesting to see whether or not we really pick up the nuance in this now that we've changed some articulations. And the first half is so much more interesting than the second as a result of the fact that we've picked these out. So it could be that you don't use these kinds of basses, whether those are electric basses or this upright bass in the music that you make at all. But if you are the sort of person that is doing this and making music along these lines, I really urge you to apply the articulation sets that are available for these instruments and to begin to explore some of these articulations, because I really think that in kind of post-production, we have an opportunity to really bring parts like this to life, and it makes all the difference when it comes to eking out the kind of believability of sounds like this, and it just makes the music so much more interesting to listen to.